This happened back when I was in the 7th grade, around 12 years old. At the time, it was just my mom, my little brother, and me living in a rental house in a rundown low-income area. The neighborhood wasn't exactly friendly, but when we moved in that summer, our next-door neighbors came by to introduce themselves. It wasn't completely unusual for the area, though not something I'd really expect. For the record, this was in Oregon. My mom worked a full-time job, 8 a.m. to 5 p.m., which meant my brother and I took the bus home from school every day. Occasionally, our cousin would come home with us, and her parents would pick her up later. That little routine felt comfortable for us. One afternoon, I came home and noticed that the small family laptop we owned was missing from the countertop. I thought maybe my mom had moved it. But when she got home, we quickly realized that it wasn't just the laptop that was gone. My iPod was missing, a wallet was gone, and even my mom's safe, which had a handgun and some family valuables in it, had disappeared. Someone had very clearly broken into our home. We called the police, and when they got there, they investigated the house. They concluded that the intruder had likely entered through the doggy door that led into the garage, then used the unlocked garage door to access the house. It was terrifying to think that someone had been inside while we weren't there. The cops said they'd keep an eye on the house, and even stayed parked outside overnight. My brother and I were so scared from this invasion that we slept in my mom's room. The next day, we made sure every door and window was locked before leaving. It was a Wednesday, and my school had this random half day, so I got home around noon. This was another day where my cousin came home with me, while my brother went to a friend's house to hang out for the afternoon. Using the spare key that my mom kept under the doormat, my cousin and I let ourselves in, and for the next hour or two, we just hung out until her mom came to pick her up. After my cousin left, I was lounging in the living room playing Snake on my Nokia phone when I heard something. It was the slow creak of a door opening. I sat up on the couch, and from where I was sitting, I could see the entryway to our home. The sound was coming from the closet right next to the front door. My heart started racing as I watched the closet door swing open, and out stepped our next door neighbor. He was skinny, almost frail looking, and he had this unhealthy, gaunt appearance with sunken-in cheeks and these intense, darting eyes. He looked way older than he actually was. I would have guessed 40 at a glance, but I'd later learned that he was only 26. He was shaking so hard that his body almost seemed to vibrate, and his movements were jittery, like someone who hadn't slept in days. For a moment, we just stared at each other, both equally surprised. I think he assumed that everyone had left when my cousin did. That's when his initial shock began to fade. This was replaced by something far more terrifying. A smirk. He started walking towards me, his eyes fixed and unblinking. I was too terrified to move. When he was close enough, he grabbed my shoulders hard, with bony fingers digging into my skin. That's when he leaned in with hot breath and said, "You're pretty." I instantly tried to recoil, but he only pulled me closer. As a 12-year-old, I thought he was going to lick me. But as an adult, I think he was about to do something much worse. In that split second, adrenaline kicked in. I let my body go limp, dropping my full weight to the floor. That's when his grip loosened just enough for me to slip out of his hands as I fell onto my butt. As he bent down to grab me again, I kicked up with everything I had, aiming right between his legs. My heel connected, and he let out this loud, pained yell before doubling over and cupping himself. I didn't wait to see what he'd do next. I scrambled to my feet and made my way to the front door as fast as I could. I ran to a friend's house about 6 doors down. The friend's mom was home, and as I pounded on the door, gasping and crying, she immediately let me in, called the police and my mom. When the cops arrived at our house, the neighbor was gone. He managed to steal a few more small items before fleeing, but I gave the officers a full description of him and told them who he was. That same day, he was caught at a local pawn shop trying to sell some of our stolen belongings. It turned out he was a meth addict, desperate for money to fuel his habit. The drugs had left him physically weak. That's probably the only reason I was able to escape. He later admitted that he'd been high during the attack, which gives you an idea of just how out of his mind he was when he tried to grab me. The investigation from the cops revealed even more disturbing details. Over the course of several months, he'd been watching our house, learning our schedules. At some point, he'd taken the spare key from under the doormat to make a copy and put the original back without us noticing. The police were shocked at the level of planning, given how dim-witted he seemed in many other ways. I testified against him in court, recounting every detail of the attack. He was already on parole for drug charges, so the physical assault and robbery added up to a long sentence. Several decades, if I remember correctly. After that night, I just couldn't put that fear to bed. I slept in my mom's room for the next year, jumping at every little sound I heard. It took a long time for me to feel safe again, and even now, I'm much more cautious than I ever was before. Looking back, I'm just grateful I had the presence of mind to act the way that I did. Sometimes, instincts are all you have to rely on. Hey guys, if you're into the content that we create, we've got a Patreon where you can support the show and get early access to new episodes before everyone else. Just head on over to patreon.com/Malevolent Mischief or check the link in the description and join our community today. When I was a preteen, I got into bird watching. It wasn't really official by any means. I was just some kid that liked to sneak up on birds, take pictures, and then look them up in books. I decided to start this hobby by making a list with pictures that I had printed from the library of all the native birds in my region. Every weekend, I'd wander around the neighborhood, which was suburbs smashed against large plots of land covered in brush, all in search of new birds. With a few ponds and a large creek in the area, I found quite a few within my first few weeks. But there was one bird I had set as sort of my white whale due to its rarity, and that was the black vulture. We have tons of turkey vultures in my area. They're the most common, but many fewer black vultures. It's difficult to tell the difference between the two if they're flying too high. The best way to determine which vulture it is has to do with how much gray and white there is on their wings. If they got closer, you'd eventually be able to make out the red head of the turkey vulture, as I often did, disappointingly. Unfortunately, I can't remember the exact date or what month this took place in, but one weekend, I decided to spend the next 2 days searching high and low for the elusive black vulture. I went climbing over the small wire fencing around a nearby brushy area as per usual. All the keep out signs be damned, just to start my search. Usually, you had the best luck finding scavenger birds on roadkill, and there happened to be a small 2-lane winding road that mirrored the creek nearby, just through the brush. So I cut across the sort of mini forest and headed in that direction. As much as it made me sad to see a dead deer or a possum, it was a common sight on this road, as both sides were open, with trees and undergrowth almost choking it. There are some parts of the road that almost became sort of a tunnel, due to the interlocking leaves above. It was incredibly easy for a deer or some other animal to jump out in front of a car, with neither party realizing until it was too late. Initially, I didn't have much luck. There were a few crows on the smear of a squirrel, and I even saw a few ducks swimming in the creek beside me, but nothing big. It started getting late, and despite the dangers of walking down a forest road in the looming darkness, I was determined to stay out as long as possible. I decided that I'd reach a small park area at the end of the road, and then I'd start to make my way back. I went under a small tunnel of leaves and came out on the other side. I was delighted to see the familiar shape of a large bird in the sky. It was just the right shape and size to be a vulture, but I had no hope of checking for the grayness of its feathers, as the sunlight was now limited. Instead, I was stuck following it as it slowly began to sink lower. After about 10 minutes or so, it eventually landed, and I carefully snuck forward, doing my best to avoid anything that could alert the bird of my presence. I sunk low to the ground, realizing that the bird had landed in a small clearing at the far end of a park. It was just a small open field, slightly tilted down a hill, with the parking lot up on top. I had been there before, as it was a fun spot for kids to roll down the hill due to how steep it was. I approached it from the bottom, excitement brimming when I heard several squawks and shrieks of other birds. Black vultures are much more aggressive than turkeys, and I was hoping to catch a spat. I got to the edge of the clearing and pulled out my binoculars. Two things kind of hit me at once here. One, I found it odd that they were in the middle of a park rather than closer to the road, where you'd assume they'd find roadkill. Though I reasoned that things could die anywhere, even in the middle of the park. But secondly, it smelled awful. The scent was rather light, but I've been known to have a really sensitive nose. It was this sharp, coppery scent, like when you pull rotten ground meat out of a bag. I'd smelled roadkill before, and in the heat of the day, it smelled bad, but it was nothing like this. When I put my binoculars to my eyes, I expected a deer corpse and birds fighting over it. I never in a million years thought I'd see a corpse of a completely different kind. The birds were there, and I remember the faint pang of excitement that I still had, recognizing the proud head of a black vulture, before the image of it sitting on the chest of a naked woman sucked the life right out of me. I was frozen, yet I couldn't look away. My throat tightened as I nearly puked at the sight. The birds had done surprisingly little to her body. She had what I think were cuts, but most of her was intact. What wasn't intact? The birds were at. Her eyes, lips, and her privates were red and shredded. If there was a big defining wound, I missed it, between the gathering of birds and the fading light, but what I did see, I don't think I can ever forget. I certainly haven't forgotten. I can pull up the image so clearly now, even after all this time. She was pale, almost blue in places, with blonde, crinkled hair. I sat there stupidly for who knows how long as the sun sank behind the trees. This was a time where cell phones weren't exactly common for a child to have, and I had quite the hike back home. I realized now I was in shock, and I could only move when the sudden fear that whoever did this could still be nearby hit me. I forced myself to slowly waddle backwards into the trees, not taking my eyes off the body. I didn't want to turn around for some reason. I was so scared that someone would be behind me, and I thought that if I just backed up forever, maybe nothing would happen. That strategy lasted for quite a while, until I felt like I was far enough away from the scene that I turned and booked it the entire way back home. I crashed through at least a mile of brush, and while I was smart enough to have boots and thick jeans on, my arms were bare and bleeding by the time I stopped. I paused midway through the brush by my house, realizing that, embarrassingly, I had pissed myself out of fear at some point, before nearly crawling my way through people's yards to get home. The horror didn't exactly end there, though, as I was home alone until past midnight, as my mom worked late at a diner nearby. It's stupid, and I regret it to this day, but no, I didn't call the police instantly, nor did I call my mom. I was afraid that if I did, my mom would get mad at me. I would never be allowed to go outside again, or worse, that she wouldn't believe me for some reason. I locked all the doors, double-checked, took a quick shower, and locked myself in my room. I had fallen asleep by the time my mom came home that night. I confronted her in the morning at least, but by that time, when we made the call to the police together, the body had already been found. They took my statement. We never got any calls back. I stopped birdwatching shortly after. I tried my best to find an article or news somewhere about this, but I failed in finding anything. It probably doesn't help that I can't remember the exact date. I personally have a lot of missing time from the ages of 11 to 14 for some reason, which I can't even begin to explain. There are very few things in life that I remember so well, but this is a big one. I've never shared this story with anyone outside of my own family, but I thought that it might fit here, and I apologize if not. It was sort of therapeutic, I think, telling this story after so long. I'm going to keep trying to find something to verify this, and I'll update ASAP if I find anything. To help you picture the scene, I'm going to give you an idea of what I look like at the time of this incident, 6 years ago. I'm a woman, 26 years old, 5 feet 5 inches tall, with medium-length bleach blonde hair. I was curvy at about 160 pounds, wearing black high-waisted tights and a pink crop top. It's a small detail, but it feels important. It's how I remember myself that night. It was late, and I was walking home alone from a friend's house. The streets were quiet, the kind of quiet that presses against your ears and makes every small sound you hear stand out. I lived in a rough part of the city back then, so I was no stranger to sketchy situations. Honestly, I think I'd grown overconfident, invincible even, because nothing truly bad had ever happened to me before. I always did my best to stay alert, scanning my surroundings and keeping my wits about me. I thought that would be enough. When about halfway home, maybe 10 minutes from my apartment, I noticed a van driving slowly behind me. This, in and of itself, wasn't unusual. In my city, it was depressingly common for men to roll up and proposition women walking alone, regardless of what they were wearing. I was desensitized to it, and my default reaction was annoyance, not fear. I crossed the street, putting myself next to traffic heading in the opposite direction. This was my go-to move, and it usually worked. The van disappeared briefly, turning down a side street. I kept walking, figuring that was the end of it, but a minute later, it reappeared, pulling up right beside me again. I glanced over and saw two men in the front seats. They looked similar to each other, maybe brothers, perhaps even twins. Both had dark complexions, dark eyes, and short-cropped hair. Their expressions were hard to read, but something about the way they watched me made me feel icky. Still, I wasn't scared yet. Annoyed, yes. This seemed to be just another unpleasant interruption in a long line of them. I decided to be firm. "I'm not interested," I said sharply, my voice steady. Then I crossed the street again, thinking surely that would be enough to deter them. But it wasn't. They kept circling back around, pulling up each time I switched sides. It was as if they were toying with me, testing just how far they could push. That was when I started to feel that first flicker of fear. My annoyance gave way to unease. I dealt with plenty of creepy encounters before, but this one felt different. They weren't just pestering me. They were persistent and deliberate. When they zipped past me one final time, I snapped, yelling after them to fuck off. I hoped the outburst would send a clear message, and for a few minutes it seemed like it had worked. The van disappeared and I let myself relax just a little bit. Still, I wasn't taking chances. I pulled out my phone and unlocked it, getting ready to call my sister, who I lived with at the time. That's when I heard it, this low rumble behind me growing louder. It was the van. It pulled up to the curb so quickly that it made my heart jump. Before I could even process what was happening, the passenger door flew open and one of the men jumped out. He was moving fast, and even though light was dim, I could see the emotionless look on his face. The back door of the van swung open behind him, and in that moment, I knew exactly what was about to happen. He was going to grab me, and they were going to take me. The traffic on the street was inconsistent, and there were no other cars in sight. I realized then that this is what they'd been waiting for, a moment when there were no other cars around, no other person around. Not to sound cliche, but time seemed to slow down as the man approached me. When he was about 3 strides away from me, he lifted his arm in an attempt to grab me. My mind raced, searched for something, anything that might stop him. And out of sheer desperation, I acted. I tilted my phone towards him, holding it up like I was recording. "You're being filmed," I said in a voice calm but loud enough to carry. "My friends in the chat have your license plate number, and the police have already been notified." The lie spilled out of me so naturally that it almost felt real. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might give me away, but I kept my face as steady as I could. I even tilted the phone a little more, as if to give my imaginary audience a better view of him. The man turned to stone for a second, his expression twisted into something between doubt and anger. I could tell he was weighing his options, trying to decide if I was bluffing. I held my breath, praying that he wouldn't call me on it. when finally he turned and ran back towards the van, slamming the door behind him. The driver hit the gas and they sped off so fast that the tires screeched against the pavement. I stood there, absolutely rooted into the sidewalk, watching taillights disappear down the street. My hands were shaking, my phone still clutched tightly in my grip. I didn't call anyone right away. I didn't even move. I just stood there trying to process what had just happened. I could tell the adrenaline was wearing off because I was hit by a wave of nausea and this deep, bone-deep exhaustion. When I finally forced myself to keep walking, I was hyper-aware of every shadow, every sound, and the short distance to my apartment felt like miles. That night, I lay awake for hours, replaying the encounter in my head. The what-ifs were the most terrible part. What if I hadn't thought to use my phone? What if he'd called my bluff? What if there hadn't been enough time for me to act at all? I'd always prided myself on being alert and prepared, but that night shattered any illusion of control that I thought I had. In the days and weeks that followed, I noticed a shift. I no longer felt safe walking alone, even in broad daylight. The confidence that I'd once had was gone, replaced by a constant undercurrent of anxiety. I started taking different routes home, avoiding certain streets, and always looking behind me. 6 years later, I still think about that night. It didn't define me, but it changed me in ways that I can't ignore. I take my safety much more seriously now, and I'm far more cautious about the risks that I take. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that no amount of confidence or vigilance can actually make you invincible. Sometimes, the only thing standing between you and danger is a split-second decision. That, and a little bit of luck.